morning or afternoon or whenever you're watching this. I'm going to cover some of the stuff that we just learned about in the last time we went through notes. Just go through it real fast so we can get back on track. Some classes missed some stuff because we ran out of time, so I'll go through some of that. But if you end up not being able to keep up with notes, you know that you can always pause this and write down some stuff, rewind things, listen to things again. So I'll go a bit fast, but we have a lot to cover. Today is really the second half of the Industrial Revolution, which is the big changes that it leads to. And some of you may have kind of picked up on this based on our last class, which was the one where we did our worker simulation, where I was the factory owner and you were the people trying to work for me. We now know that factories lead to huge changes in society and pollution, and we drew all that stuff over a whole period, but we haven't really gotten into the changes that come out of this in terms of how people change their work. We've seen how work changes people, but not really how people change their work. The short response I'm getting at is unions. Some of you, all of you, heard that when we did our worker simulation, people wanted to unionize, and this is going to start a whole new movement. Since these changes in work to people's lives are so extreme, people are going to respond to that and try and change their work so that it's better and more fair. So again, I'll go over the basics that we've learned about so far and then get into the new stuff. Hopefully won't take more than 40 minutes or so. So to start off, we know that the Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain for a lot of reasons. Had a lot of smart people, had a lot of money, had a good government, stable economy. All these things make it more likely that people are going to want to innovate in your country and be encouraged to do so, be successful doing so. They had the resources to be successful, they had colonies, so all this stuff is all good reason why Britain is able to succeed at the Industrial Revolution. They are the country where the Industrial Revolution begins. They get a huge advantage from this. That's a whole other effect that we'll get into the second half of this unit. By them having this advantage of being more powerful and having more money, they use that to conquer other countries, to make themselves more powerful so that they can conquer more countries, and so on and so forth. That's imperialism, but that's getting ahead. For now, you should just be aware that Britain had a lot of these things that made it likely that they would be successful when it came to innovating and growing wealth. I talked about how one of the main effects of industrialization is people moving to cities, especially these cities form around where coal is. So people more and more move to cities and urbanize. We drew that. We see some early inventions like the water wheel and the ability to use this engineering feat to create more efficient machines like a steam engine. And the steam engine leads to all sorts of changes for other industries. It helps coal miners mine more coal by pumping water out of coal mines so that they can continue to dig deeper and deeper. It makes steamboats and railroads possible, and it powers virtually any machine. So especially textiles. Textiles become the first industry to industrialize. I may have showed you these videos, but you don't have to watch them. You can't even click on them anyway. But the point is, textiles become the first industry to use some of these great innovations. This makes Britain the world's largest textile maker, fabric maker, for a very long time. There's part of that process, and some of it hasn't changed, as you may remember. It looks very similar to the 1900s today in different places in the world where they still make textiles. Kind of crazy. History repeats itself, or rather, at least it rhymes. Changes to farms we talked about, inventions like the seed drill that allow seeds to be spaced at regular intervals so farms become more productive. That leads to more food leads to healthier people. Healthier people means less disease means less deaths, and that means a rising population. The Enclosure Act also by Britain encourages people to move to cities because it eliminates the commons. We drew that on our city drawings the other day. So poor people now don't have land to farm, end up moving to cities to work. This is about where some of my classes ended. This picture shows you the change from before on the left to after the Enclosure Act. Before the Enclosure Act, all sorts of different people owned land. Nobles owned lots of land, and we're just generally rich people, but there's also these common areas. And then after the Enclosure Acts here on the right, some of these rich people bought up a lot of that extra land, and the green common land gone. People then have to do something else. The diffusion of the Industrial Revolution from England is kind of like waves in a pond. You can see the farther you are from England, the less likely you are to get the Industrial Revolution, or the longer it takes you. So if England is the most powerful because it got it first, the second most powerful country in the world will be somewhere that gets it next. Places like France or Germany. That means places like Russia will be far behind when it comes to development, and that means that these countries will be able to dominate some of these weaker countries. This will be important when we get to World War I, when Russia is fighting against some of these more powerful countries like Germany. Just can't keep up. As for the global diffusion, it spreads to places nearby, kind of like what we saw in Europe. The United States isn't far from Europe. We are a colony of England for a long time. We get a lot of the benefits of the Industrial Revolution. That's largely why the United States is so powerful early on. But other places get it, namely Japan. We'll talk about that later. But this makes Japan very powerful. Just like Britain becomes powerful in its area because it's the first to get the Industrial Revolution, Japan is powerful in its area because it's the first to get the Industrial Revolution in Asia. All right, let's move on. The social effects are really what I want to focus on today. In short, one of the major social effects of the Industrial Revolution is that people become healthier and wealthier. This is great. In summary, average lifespan for the best countries in the world in 1800 was 40. Average lifespan was 40 years old, and generally people weren't very wealthy. Of course, today, 200 years later, no country in the world has a lifespan worse than 50. So at worst, you're living on average 10 years longer. At best, you have countries like Japan where the average lifespan is pretty close to 90, which is insane. So how does this improving health happen? Well, death rates drop due to a lot of factors. For one, I've already told you there's going to be more food. Secondly, sanitation improves, water supply improves. Chicago's got great examples of how we did this. Our Chicago River flowed, past tense, used to flow into our source of water, Lake Michigan. The Chicago River was also, unfortunately, the location where pretty much all of our wastewater went. So our human waste and industrial waste. So if our river, which is filled with waste, flows into our water supply, lots of people who drink that water will get sick. And Chicago did have lots of deaths from drinking disgusting, diseased, toxic water until we reversed the flow of the Chicago River. If we were in class and I had more time, I'd show you how or explain to you how, but basically, since water always flows downhill, we just dug a deeper hole the opposite direction for the Chicago River to flow into. We dug a giant canal, and it was deeper than the river, so it made the river flow the opposite direction, and that saved our lake water. So now we all have clean drink water, and that, of course, makes you live longer. So many changes like that will enable people to have a better water supply, but initially the death rates in many places will increase. So since you may remember in our drawings, I talked about how we had lots of people dying for lots of reasons. Factory jobs are dangerous, people are drinking dirty water, cancer becomes more of a problem. All these things cause death rates to initially increase and the average lifespan to drop. But long term, of course, as I mentioned today, 200 years, 250 years since the start of the Industrial Revolution, we're all now living way longer. Another reason people will live longer is because of better medical care. We drew hospitals on our map. There will be the invention of vaccines, people studying diseases and understanding that thanks to the scientific revolution, that bacteria causes diseases. So we start coming up with some of the world's first antibiotics. It'll take a while, but they'll get there. We'll have more wealth due to better transportation. If you can ship things more cheaply, stuff is cheaper. This will also allow people to eat more food, because if you are far from a transport point, that means you can't get a lot of food brought to you unless transportation is made easier. Same for medical supplies, so people will live longer because they can get better access to stuff, and it's cheaper. We'll have eventually better working conditions, even though initially they're very dangerous and there's no regulations. Government steps in and starts to make work more safe, allows people to make more money, not thanks to the government necessarily, but minimum wage laws will eventually become a real thing. So in general, workers will start to make more money, at least more money than if they were a peasant farmer, and the work will initially be very strenuous. 15-hour days, 16-hour days. Talked about already many times how nasty work conditions were, and you just read some for homework hopefully, but eventually work will get better. Today, you hopefully know the typical workday is supposed to be about 8 hours. It's not. I couldn't give you data on what the average workday is for Americans, but it's probably somewhere around 9 or 10 hours. But that's way better than 16. So life expectancy increases very quickly, and we see a really huge amount of population growth. I'll show you a chart in a second. It's absolutely insane how much population growth we have. But this chart sort of shows you a broader trend that countries will start to go through. You don't have to read through all this and absorb all this stuff, but for almost all of human history, countries were in this stage where you have high death rates. This red line is the death rate in a country, a high death rate and a high birth rate. So let's say you're a typical family. Maybe you have 7 kids and 3 of them die. You're not really gaining many people. Some families will have all their kids die. People will die at young ages. Some people will never have kids. And all this evens out to essentially no population growth for most of human history. We have in a country, so instead of just a small family, I'll give you an example of a country. A country in a year might have, I'll make up a number, 1 million births, but also 1 million deaths. So nationally, or in total for that country, they're not growing at all. If they're growing, it's only a small amount. All this changes when the Industrial Revolution begins. Even though stage 3 is called the industrial stage, it really is stage 2 here. So the United Kingdom, Great Britain, is the first place to see this huge drop in death rates due to all the things that I talked about, but their birth rates still remain high. You've got now a huge difference between a death rate and a birth rate. If a country that used to have 1 million births and 1 million deaths now has 200,000 deaths and still 1 million births, you're gaining 800,000 people a year. I mean, it's all relative, but you can see that that's a huge number. So eventually, birth rates need to decrease, and we'll maybe talk about how that happens eventually another day, but today, people have just about as many kids as, at least in the U.S., as are dying in the country every year. I would encourage you to think about your grandparents and how many siblings they had versus how many siblings you have today. You're only 2 generations removed from your grandparents, but I bet you it's a far different number. Everyone has 4 grandparents, of course, and I can tell you that at least for one of my grandparents, I don't know about all of them and how many siblings they had, but my mom's mother had, I think, 7 siblings, so she was one of 8 kids, and I am one of 2. My mother was one of 4 kids, so if my grandma was one of 8 kids, then she had 4 kids, and my mom had 2 kids. You can see the number drastically decreasing. Well, seems absurd to have 8 kids today, and yet only 60, 70 years ago, 80 years ago, 7 or 8 was normal. So really interesting to think about how quickly that changes for countries. And today, we basically have no growth in the U.S. The only growth that we have in our population is because we are a wonderful country that attracts lots of immigrants. Notice our world population starts to pick up around 1800. So if the Industrial Revolution begins somewhere around here, eventually some of these benefits of better health and wealth start to be realized, at least the health stuff, and speed up to the point where, as I mentioned, we're somewhere around 7.5 billion. We're kind of hard to read here on this chart, but we're somewhere around here, 7.5 billion people. And the predictions here that this chart show us getting way higher in the next 30 years or so. These predictions vary depending on who you ask, but the main point you should be aware of is that if it took us as a human civilization tens of thousands of years to get to 1 billion people around early 1800s. Amazingly, in the last 200 years, we have added 6.5 billion people. It's just absolute insanity. Interestingly, important change to human population growth rates is that while they have seemed to have been getting faster and faster and faster and faster and faster, what we've seen the last 10 or 20 years or so is that for the first time in human history, population growth is finally starting to slow down. It's not decreasing yet overall, but instead of us growing, let's say 3% per year as a global population, we're now growing like 2% or 1.5%. So we may see in our lifetimes, pretty crazy trend to imagine, we may actually see the global population start to decrease or at least even out, so that we've got globally the same number of births as we have deaths, and our human population may actually start to shrink in the future. This is really encouraging in the face of climate change and concerns about whether we can get people enough water and food, and how do we deal with all the waste. There's other concerns if your population drops. Will everyone have enough jobs? Will there be enough jobs? What do you do with all the declining areas? So all sorts of concerns all around, but I'd say a decrease in this population growth rate is really positive. There used to be people that would argue that eventually the world is going to be too overpopulated, we're never going to have enough food, and they were wrong. 200 years ago, when we reached 1 billion people, there were some people who said, well, surely there's no way the globe can handle 2 billion people. And then when we got to 2 billion, they said, oh, well, surely there's no way we could handle 3 billion, and so on, until the point where, well, we can handle 7.5 billion people. It sort of depends on how you define handle. There's a lot of poor people in the world, but there's also a lot of rich people, so maybe it all just needs to be redistributed. It's not a problem of whether we have enough, it's whether we can be fair with it or distribute it all. So that's a whole other question. But now we don't have to worry about us getting to 100 billion people. That would be seemingly unsustainable. You know, the world cannot fit 1 trillion people as far as I can imagine. So I think the slowdown is positive, but that's my own opinion. Other things that happen because of increasing health and wealth is a rising middle class. So this is the better wealth part. The rising middle class will come from lots of things. People are going to make more money. This will come to happen because people will get more education and better jobs. If we had time, I'd show you this great video from that guy. I may post it in the links to our assignment center that explains just how much our health and wealth has gone up over the years. It's a pretty cool 4-minute video. The ability to produce things in factories in huge numbers leads to cheaper goods, as we've talked about before. If you think about the laws of supply and demand, the greater the supply of something, the cheaper the product. Don't know many people who have paid for air in their lives because air is free, and yet something like gold is always expensive because it's so rare. So if you can make shirts go from rare to common by producing them so quickly, that will lead to lots of shirts. That leads to cheaper goods, of course. That makes people better off. If suddenly now you don't have to spend as much money on your stuff, that allows you to keep more money or buy more stuff, and that makes your life better. People are also going to make more money. It's like a double bonus. Not only is stuff cheaper, but you also make more money at your job. This allows for people to pull themselves up out of the lower classes as long as they get a decent factory job that pays them an all right wage. They're going to be able to make way more money because they're not only earning more, they're saving more by their ability to buy cheaper goods. So you can see here this chart shows wages in Britain from 1850 to 1900, roughly a 50-year time span. Essentially they double. This is not a raw number like a minimum wage going from $5 to $10 because money loses its value over time. So a real wage is the real value of that money, not how much money you're getting paid, but the value of that money. So the value of people's money or their earnings at work doubles in about 50 years. That's outstanding. There will also be tons of jobs for people, so not only do they pay decently, now more people are making good money. And all this attracts people to cities. As we drew in our charts or on our city drawings, more and more people are leaving farms because there's less and less farm jobs, and there's more and more jobs in the city. So countries, for the first time, will become more urban than rural. This happened globally for the first time about 10 years ago, sometime in the late 2000s. The world as a whole was mostly living in cities rather than farm areas for the first time in human history. This is a huge, amazing change. Cities are going to grow for a bunch of reasons. First of all, machines make farms more efficient. So as I told you, there's less farmers needed. If machines replace people, the people have to go somewhere, and a lot of them just move to cities because that's where the jobs are. The Enclosure Act that I reminded you of at the start of this lesson creates larger farms and puts farmers out of work. So those farmers, again, move to the cities most often. And the immigration will increase for many countries because there will be a desire to find jobs. So if we think of Ireland, next door to Great Britain, when Ireland experiences a famine and lots of people can't farm anymore because it's unsuccessful and they're starving, and moving to places where there's work, so places like Britain, and of course they'd prefer to move to a city if they can get a job there. Urbanization will lead to a whole bunch of things that are problems, and we drew all of these, so I don't need to go into great detail, but the short summary is they get too crowded. If everybody's moving to cities, then there's probably not enough stuff for these people. Housing, sanitation, jobs. You can see some examples here of data from major British cities. They don't have London on here, but I'm sure the numbers would be ridiculous. London was always huge, but these are towns that go from rural to urban, just like ours did that we drew. So let's just take one case. Birmingham had 74,000 people in 1801, and 90 years later, they were roughly, let me do the math here, that's 7 times larger, almost exactly 7 times larger. The same is true for just about all of these here. Some of them grow even faster. So how do you create enough stuff for all those people? It would be so difficult. Pollution will also increase. Of course, all these factories are eventually going to be running on coal-powered steam engines, and they will be creating toxic waste, lead and mercury. There will be no government environmental regulations, and so all this stuff will just be out in the air for everyone. Soot-covered homes, people drinking disgusting water, trees being chopped down. So life is pretty nasty in cities for a long time. Some people won't get a lot of these benefits, and they will turn to a life of crime to try and solve their problems. We'll see alcoholism, we drew all this stuff, and child labor. Child labor will need to be solved eventually, but initially child labor is a great solution for a lot of families who are struggling. First, I'll say that child labor, which seems inappropriate today, was normal for most of history. Don't think of child labor as working in a factory. Children used to labor on farms. As soon as you could walk, you'd be put to the task doing something. This was part of the reason why people used to have so many kids. If you're working on a farm, you can't really farm very well if you only have 2 or 3 or 4 people. You need to have 6, 7, or 8 people to get all the work done. So people would have more kids. Well, eventually, kids are going to get replaced by machines, so you can have less kids on a farm. But for families that are still large, and they're going to be large for a long time, you got a lot of mouths to feed, and these kids need to start figuring out for themselves how to feed themselves. What I'm getting at is they need to go get a job. Kids are also cheap. So if I'm an employer and I got 2 people to hire and one of them can do the job and the other one can do the job just about the same, I'm going to choose the one that's cheaper. If that's a kid, so be it. Generally, kids are going to get paid 1/3 to 1/6 what an adult male would make. And they will also be useful because they'll have small hands and arms, so they can reach into machines to fix things or pull things out that fall. So there you can see a kid who has lost his arm in a factory. I sort of joke about this. Hey, can you give me a hand with this? No, never mind. But the sad fact, of course, is that this kid probably lost his arm in a factory job. And while he may have been compensated by the company for losing his arm, he probably was not. It was unusual to get paid if you were injured on the job. The employers didn't have to pay you. There was no regulation that said, hey, you have to compensate this person for losing part of their body because of your unsafe working conditions. So if he got paid or his family got paid, that was lucky. But pretty much in every case, you were then fired from your job because you were no longer capable of doing the work. So the company is not going to keep you around. There was no requirement for the company to keep you around. So really sad fact of life that if you worked in a factory, there were a lot of risks that you took with you, and you just hope that it turned out well. A lot of kids are going to work and be happy to work because the family needs money so badly. So many families will just barely scrape by in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, and kids will be working in factories in the U.S. until late 1800s, even early 1900s in different parts of the country. Here's a rough idea of what it was like for you to work at different ages. You might start working as young as 7 in a factory and typically work 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. This letter shows you just what it would be like if you were working in a factory and got injured. This is a real letter from 1859. If you can't read it or you don't want to read it, my summary is there in text. This is a letter from 1859 from a factory inspector, like a safety inspector perhaps, to a factory owner, and it's to arrange compensation for a 13-year-old girl named Martha, who was working under a machine to get some cotton that fell, and her hand got caught in a wheel, causing her to lose all her fingers on one hand. The family asked for 150 pounds, that's British money, that's equal to about $22,000 today, and she also lost her job because she was no longer able to work in the factory fast enough. So, would you be okay with losing all your fingers on one of your hands for $22,000? Keep in mind that this family was lucky, quote unquote lucky, to get compensated by the company. I would not want $22,000 for all my fingers. I would probably want something closer to a couple million. So 22,000, not going to cut it, but they probably were happy to get anything. Just as a related note, my brother works in insurance, and there are still rates set today by insurance companies for compensating you for lost limbs and fingers and stuff. In Illinois, if you lost all of your fingers on one hand, you would get 206 weeks of compensation for your job. So let's say you earned $1,000 a week at your job, you'd get $206,000 and 60% of that. So instead of getting $206,000, you would get roughly $122,000. So still not enough for me, but it kind of depends on how much you get paid at your job. Chances are, if I'm working at a factory job, $1,000 a week is probably somewhere in the right neighborhood. So really tough laws back in the day when there was no compensation, but today it's better, but maybe still not good enough. Who knows? That's up for you to decide. Here's an example of some child laborers. These are what are called colliers. These were coal miners, and you can see that they're young. These are girls, probably between the ages of, I would guess maybe 8 and 15, perhaps. They would spend most of their day pushing wagons up from a mine shaft to a heap of coal. They would stack the coal, rake out any stones that were not coal. That was their job for about 12 hours a day. How much fun that would have been. This is maybe my favorite picture of the Industrial Revolution. These are kids who are obviously working in some sort of horrible industrial job, ready to go to work, dirty faces, poor families, who knows what their conditions are. But check out these faces of these kids. Unhappy, 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 really unhappy, 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 unhappy. And then there's this kid. Like, what is wrong with that kid? He's even got his hand around his buddy's shoulder. Like, hey guys, you guys ready to go work today? Isn't work great? Wow, yeah. You know he probably got beat up like every day. I mean, I guess if I had to think about why he was smiling, maybe it's just because he was happy he got a job. I have no idea. But mostly, I think these faces show you how awful life was for a lot of kids. It just was not fun to be a factory working child. These are children, younger than all of you. So while it may not be that comforting, if you don't enjoy school, you're living in one of the best countries in the world, in a warm, wonderful school surrounded by your friends, where you get to have everything provided for you, essentially. You paid for it, but these kids never had that opportunity. probably didn't make it very far in life. And you've got the whole world in front of you. So pretty cushy. These kids would have killed to be where you are. And that's how it was for most of the time of the Industrial Revolution, and for most of human history. If you were a child, you'd be working. So, and for some people, sadly, in the world, life is still like this. So, help people. Anyway, last things we'll talk about, changes to work. I told you that people's work will change them, but the people will also change their work. People's lives will sort of be upended by this. You'll go to working a set schedule instead of working till the work was done. Before the Industrial Revolution, you lived on a farm, you worked till the work was done. You woke up in the morning, it was time for you to get to work, and then you worked till you finished harvesting or doing whatever you had to do. Who knows how long the workday would have been, but it would have varied, and you would have worked at your own pace, and you would have gotten it all done eventually. Made a decent living on your own independently. Now you've got to work from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. every day, or 6 days a week. Breadwinners of the family will typically be men. It used to be that all the families would contribute on a farm, all the family members would contribute. Now it's pretty much going to be men. Women will stick at home and do the housework. Some of them will work in factories. Children will, of course, work in factories, but the main breadwinners will eventually become men once child labor laws get rid of child labor. People start to live farther from work. As transportation gets better, you used to live pretty close to work, and then as trains come around and make transportation pretty quick, a lot of people will move farther away because it's still cheap to live farther away, and then you just take a train to work. And a lot of work will be paid less than it used to be. I know I've talked about earnings going up. This will eventually happen for lots of reasons like unions and government regulations, but a lot of work is going to be pretty crummy in terms of the amount of skill it requires. Let's say you were a butcher. If you're a butcher, you know how to take apart an entire cow or a pig, but eventually even that process will be done by either machines or by lots of different people instead of one person. So you don't know how to take apart an entire cow. If you're working in a factory that slaughters cows, you only do one job over and over again. That means that since you're not skilled, your pay is going to decrease because anyone can do your job. And it also means that it's easy to replace you because anyone can do your job. So you have competition. That reduces your pay, and your job is easy, which sort of creates competition, and also reduces your pay. People, on the other hand, though, as I mentioned, are going to have cheaper goods, so consumerism grows. Consumerism is just the idea that you now go shopping for stuff. People used to really only have money to spend on the things they needed. It wasn't like you'd go out and buy a new pair of shoes because you wanted a new pair of shoes. You now have the money to buy these things because you eventually will get paid decently at a job, and these things will be so cheap for you. So while on the one hand your job may stink or not be that great, you get these huge benefits because at least the money that you spend gets you more than it used to. Then we'll see these challenges of the great divide between rich and poor attempt to be solved by people. This is what we did in our last class when we did our worker simulation, and many of you tried to start a union. The basic summary is that we're talking about two different systems or philosophies of living. You've got capitalism, where people get very rich, and that's often at the expense of poor people. And then you've got communism. Capitalism is based on the word capital, money. So this word basically means moneyism. This is the idea that all of your decisions in life essentially come down to what's it going to make me and what's it going to cost me. A lot of you are going to go to college, and probably more college, and you're going to go get jobs, and you're doing all this stuff because you want to get good jobs. And then when you get a good job, you're going to want a better job. And then when you go shopping for stuff, you're not going to pay an exorbitant amount of money for something if you can get the same thing cheaper somewhere else. I find it amazing that people pay for Supreme branded stuff and pay ridiculous amounts of money because these are just clothes. They're made very cheaply. So I don't know. I mean, everyone makes their own choices, but if you're spending $150 on a hoodie, you got too much money. So capitalism at its finest, though, for Supreme. Supply is low, so the price is high, and if you got the money, you can buy it and feel special. So capitalism will create these haves and have-nots, rich people and then some poor people. This will lead to people revolting, the rise of communism, this economic system where people are going to hopefully start to have equal wealth. Equal wealth will come from the fact that people are going to have to overthrow factory owners and instead put in their place people who have goals that are more fair-minded. Instead of allowing rich people to get rich, how about you distribute some of that money? It's going to be started by that guy with the beard, Karl Marx. He writes this document in 1848 called the Communist Manifesto that essentially outlines the basic ideas of his idea of communism, where eventually he says workers will revolt, as some of you tried to do in our worker simulation, overthrow the factory owners and start to take over things themselves. He sees capitalism as the enemy. This is the source of problems. Capitalism, or what's called laissez-faire economics, which is advocated by this guy, Adam Smith, that's the source of all the problems in the world. So all means of production, land, factories, transportation, should be owned by the government instead of by individuals. The government will distribute things fairly so that everyone has an equal amount of wealth, everyone gets a home, nobody's unemployed, everyone gets educated, there's no rich people, no poor people, everybody's middle class. This will not generally be successful. There aren't many communist countries in the world today. There's lots of problems with this system, which maybe I'll get into another day, but the short answer is people are lazy and governments get corrupted. But the success of this will be that unions will grow and be encouraged to fight powerful companies, and today unions still stick up for poor workers. I'd ask you how you feel about collective bargaining, but this isn't a discussion, so maybe some other day we'll have time to talk about it. But one of the big changes to work will come from the rise of communism and eventually socialism, which is sort of like the compromise between communism and capitalism. No country in the world today is completely capitalist. It would lead to insane things, like if I invented a cure for cancer, which would be awesome, I would be able to charge $1 million a pill for it. I wouldn't care about poor people who couldn't afford it because that's not my problem. Capitalism is all about me making the most money possible, so I'm going to sell it for the highest profit to the highest bidder.